What up? Wimbush here, and I'm excited to be at Adobe Max 2019 with AMD. Now, in this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to go from Cinema 4D into Unreal, and for this, I'm going to be using an AMD A+A solution, which is using the Ryzen 9 3900X and the Radeon 5700 XT GPU. And so for the first step, we're going to start in Cinema 4D. We're going to be using the Kit Bash from Pixel Labs. We're going to build out a cool platforming level, and then we're going to jump into After Effects with the Metal Flux plugin. We're going to build out an HDR, and then we're going to use that to light our scene in Unreal. Now, once we're in Unreal, we're going to bring everything we made in After Effects to Cinema 4D, bring it all together in Unreal, and we're going to make an interactive platforming level. And I'm even going to show you how to make an executable, so if you want to share it with your friends, you can do that. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, so I'm going to get started with Cinema 4D. I have version R20 open here, and I'm going to use the Sci-Fi Kit Bash that we got from Pixel Labs. So I'm just going to come over to my content browser, come over to computer, find out where I have my Kit Bash, which I have under products. Then I'm going to pull it up. It's called Hurl Surface Pack version 2. Let me click this lib4d file. And then I'm going to pull my panel out so that I can see my Kit Bash and my objects panel at the same time. So all I did was I came up here, undocked it, and then I'm going to dock it to the right hand side here. And so now we can see our Kit Bash and we can see what we're working with. So if I come over, let's start by making a floor for our character to run on. And so before I do anything else, I'm actually going to bring in the mannequin from Cinema 4D, and this will be able to give us our reference size for our character in Unreal. So if I come over here and I click figure, this mannequin, he's around, I want to say, it's 180 centimeters, so around 5'8", 5'9", somewhere around there, like an average height for a person. So now I have a good reference size for when I'm making my floor, how large to make it, so when I bring it into Unreal, everything should be 1-to-1. So I'm going to come over to my content browser over here, and we actually have, in the Kit Bash, we have a section for floors. So if you click on that, we have like a whole plethora of different kind of floors that we could choose from. So I'm going to start with this one, panel 06, because it has these grates on there that look really cool. And you can see when I double click on it, it comes into our hierarchy panel here on the right hand side. And so instead of laying out each panel on the floor, this is where the power of Cinema 4D comes in. If I go up to MoGraph, come down to Cloner, I can actually put this panel into my Cloner, and it's just going to duplicate it out in an instance. And so whenever you do it this way, it's going to start with a linear mode instance, which is going to be just stacking on top of each other. But what we want to do is come down to mode and come down to grid array, and you give that a second to click in, and you'll actually see we have like a whole Q rib in here, or grid in here. And so we only want it to be flat on the ground. We don't want to have it in our y-axis. So here in count, in our Y area, I'm going to click this down to 1, and then for my panel count, right now we have 3 by 3. I'm going to extend, actually I want this one to be 3, and then let's extend this out to 10. So give that a second, and we can pull these out. So now you can see we have 3 rows of panels by 10. And so if we pull in here a little bit, you can see that our reference mannequin is way larger than our panel. And so if we come over to our cloner object, come over to transform, right here where it says S, that stands for scale. And so right now it's 1 by 1 by 1. Let's start by making it like 5 by 5 by 5. Let's see where that gets us to. We could click these handles and drag these out a little bit. So that looks like 5 by 5 by 5 should work. You zoom out here a little bit. Okay, yeah, so that should work. 5 is a good size for that. So I'm going to come over to object, and right under endpoint here where you see size, this is where whenever we pull on our handles here, you can see that it correlates with our size. So this is basically just how far apart you're pulling your grid around. So I like to work with even numbers. I like to get it really close in here, and then once I get in a good spot, I'm just going to even it out. So it looks like 500 will work for there. And then I'm going to go on my other axis here. I'm going to pull in this gray panhandle to just where it about touches. So it looks like 2250. I'm going to even that out, 2250. And so that works for that. Okay, let me pull up my mannequin a little bit just so he's not going through the floor. So next, I'm going to build the background wall because we're going to be making a platformer. So we have our floor panel and now we want our background wall. So if I come back over to my kit bash, hit the up key here, and this is in alphabetical order. So if I come down to walls, double click on that, we have more walls options that we can pick from. And these all come pre-textured and everything for Cinema 4D. And the cool thing about the Datasmith plugin with Unreal to Cinema 4D, we could take our cloner, we could take our textures, bring those all in, and everything will align with each other. So we don't have to retexture in Unreal or anything. So I like this wall 13 because it has a cool emission texture on there which we can use for lighting. So I'm gonna double click on this, and you can see we have a small wall that came up under our mannequin here. So instead of changing it here, I'm gonna bring this over to a MoGraph cloner, and then I'm going to drag my wall into that cloner, and same thing, it's going to stack it going on the y-axis. So I'm going to come over to my cloner, I'm going to zero it out on my y-axis, and I'm actually going to pull this back, and I'm going to get to the correct size before we clone it out. So as you can see, it's backwards as well. So all I have to do is come over to transforms, and I'm just going to rotate it. There we go, so we should be able to rotate it at an even 180 to bring it face forward. And now, let's stick with 5x5x5, that should give us a good sizing. Yep, so that aligns right where we have our panels at for our floor. So now, it's just all about aligning it to your liking. So I'm gonna bring it all the way to the left where the start of our floor panels are. Like so. There we go. And pull this up a little bit. All right, cool. So now we have our start to our background wall. So if we go back under the object tag here, where you see it says count, I'm going to bring this up to 10 because we had 10 floor panels going out. So I'm going to have our wall panels going out to even out. So if I go to, let me see down here, I think it's, no, it's not X. I believe it'll be Z. Yeah, so if I go negative on my Z, our cloner pulls our wall out. So there we go. We just go over to the end, and we're just going to make sure our wall lines up with our floor, which looks like it's about negative 250. There we go. And if we go in the overhead view, we can see that's not touching our floor. So I'm just going to pull this in a little bit. And so that should work out for us right there. Looks pretty even. So now we have a floor panel, and we have our background wall. And you can see that our kit bash, it came with this blue light, but I'm going to make my own emission texture here. So I'm going to come down to where my materials are, double click, and it's going to make a new material, which is called matte. And so I'm going to double click on the matte, and I'm just going to name this neon, because I'm going to make it like a blue neon light, kind of like a synthwave type vibe. So if I click on this, double click on it, and I'm going to click off of my color and reflectance, and come up to luminance and turn this on. And then I'm going to come over here, and I'm just going to change this to like a bluish color. And I'm going to leave my brightness at 100%, leave it at default, because whenever we bring it into Unreal, we can actually we could work with our lighting in there and get it to where we need it to be. So I'm going to stick with 100 brightness on this, and I'm going to hold down the Alt key on the keyboard, and I'm going to click and drag it over top of my other default light here, and that replaces it. And as you can see in our viewport, it replaced that material. And so now what I want to do is I'm going to rename this cloner wall so we know what this is. And then for my cloner floor, I'm going to name this cloner floor, just because when we bring it into Unreal, we're going to have that hierarchy carry over. And before I go any further, it's always a good idea to save too. So I'm going to hit Control S, and I'm going to go to where I have my tutorial folder, Cinema 4D. And I'm just going to name this AMD game level. There we go. Let me click save here. All right, and so now I'm ready for my next step. I'm actually going to duplicate my wall that I just made because I want to make it a little bit taller. So I'm just going to duplicate it and then pull it up. And then I'm going to rotate it a little bit, kind of give it like a cool sci-fi effect. Let me see if I rotate it, not on that axis, I want to rotate it on this axis. So let me try 45. And bring this over a little bit. So the cool thing about the kit bash is just like playing with Legos. Like you have your elements already pre-built out. You just come in here and just connect them to your pleasing. So something like that looks cool. If you look into reference where our mannequin is, now we have our wall kind of towering over and it's tilted. So it's going to give us some cool lighting effects when we bring it into Unreal. We're going to have this wall panel actually reflect off our floor panels here. So the last thing I want to do now is I want to make some steps because I'm going to duplicate this area that we just made, make a staircase, we're going to run down to it, and that's going to be end of our blocked out level here. So if I come back over to my kit bash, let me see, we can look under plates because they don't have steps per se, but we could just make our own steps with the cloner. So if I come under plate here, let me double click on this. All right, cool. So now we have our plates zeroed out in the direct center. So same thing like we did with the wall. I'm just going to come over to MoGraph, come down to Cloner, and then I'm going to bring that under the Cloner. Now I'm going to name this one Cloner Steps so we keep in step with our hierarchy. And now let me drag this over to the end of our platform here. And I'm going to scale this out so you can see a reference to the rest of the scene. Our steps are looking kind of small. So let me try 5 by 5 by 5 again. And it looks like that's a decent size there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the side and I'm going to drag this down, pull this handle and pull these down. So I want to have some steep steps. So it could be cool to go down around this far. I'm going to click on my object, zero out my X, and make sure everything is kind of straightened out. Click back on my cloner steps. Let me see, so I'm gonna do, like I said, I like working in even numbers, so negative 300 should probably work. And then for my Z, go like negative 180. And actually, let me pull these out. Those are, I wanna have it, yeah, negative 500 looks like it will work. And so now, under mode, instead of per step, like let me pull out a little bit. So if I bring up the steps on my count, or if I bring up the count on my steps, you can see that it's like going down, which I don't want. So I'm gonna put it back to 3. And this is where my endpoint's gonna be, where this handle's at. So if I come over to mode and actually hit endpoint, now when we bring up our count, it's actually gonna fill in the steps until it reaches our endpoint. So something around there looks pretty cool. We'll do 20 steps, and we'll actually drag these out a tad bit more. So negative 1500, looks like that'll work. All right, so now we have our steps. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my walls and my floor panels, and I'm gonna put these into their own object so that we can duplicate them and put them at the bottom of our steps. So instead of null, I'm gonna just name this platform 1. All right, cool. So then I'm gonna hold control on my keyboard, click and drag this down. And then I'm gonna name this one platform 2. Actually, before I do that, let me put a wall in here so that we have something, so we don't just run off the edge. So I'm gonna go back into my kit bash, look for a wall, and let's do something like this could be cool. So double click on that. And let's make this wall a little bit larger. Let's see, maybe try 6 by 6 by 6. Then we're gonna bring our wall upright at an even 90. And let's drag this all the way over to the end here. And there we go. So we have a wall here so that we're not running off the edge. And I'm gonna make sure this is a part of my platform group here that I just made. Like so, make Control S just to save it. Okay, so now I'm gonna hold Control, pull this down, name this Platform 2, which is a copy of our Platform 1. And so I'm gonna pull out a little bit, and I'm just gonna click and drag this to the bottom of our steps. There you go, something like that could be cool. Let me drag this over, and then I'm gonna take that wall that we just made, I'm gonna drag this all the way to the other end. There we go. So now we have a wall at the end of our level. So now we have platform, steps, platform, and then the end of the wall. So now that we have our stage built out, I'm going to click Control S just to make sure everything's saved in our scene here. And if you come down to our materials, you can see we have some duplicate materials in which when we bring it into Unreal, we want to kind of make this as clean as possible. So if I hold down the Alt key and left click on my one material, I'm going to click and drag over the same material here, which is Metal Clear Bump. And you can see that now we kind of combine those textures. So everything that's used in that Metal Clear Bump is now going to be off of that one texture. So I'm going to do that again. And all this is doing is just cleaning it up, which makes our file sizes smaller as well, which helps whenever we need to convert to DataSmith. And so I think we have everything we need here. So now the next step is, as I was saying, I'm in Cinema 420, or version 20, sorry, R20. And in this version, what we need to save it out for Cinema 4D is called Save Project for Melange. So if you go up to File, click it, come down here, it'll say Save Project for Melange. But if you're using the latest version, which is R21, it's called Save Project for Cineware. It does the same exact thing, it's in the same exact spot, it's just a different naming convention. So I'm going to click on this, and as you can see, I have my default Cinema 4D project. So I'm going to click on this, the one that says AMD Game Level, but instead I'm going to move it out to the end and name this one UE4. And so now I know the difference between my Cinema 4D project and then the Cinema 4D projects that we're going to bring to Unreal. So I'm going to click on this. I'm going to give it a few moments to save, and then we're going to move on to After Effects from here to make our HDR image. Okay, so now we have After Effects opened up. I'm going to come over to my project file here, my composition, click on New Composition, and I'm going to make a 4K monoscopic image for our HDR file. So right now that setting is 4096 by 2048. And for my composition, I'm just going to name this, let's say AMD HDR. And then I'm going to click OK. So now we have our composition built out. And for our HDR file, you want to make sure that you're working in a 32-bit compare. So if you need to change it, all you do is click down here, go over to your depth, and make sure you're working at 32 bits. So now I'm going to come down into my timeline. I'm going to right click, and I'm just going to make a black solid. And I'm just, yeah, I could leave this as black solid, but what we want to make sure we do, make sure you hit make comp size, because that's going to make sure that your solid is the same size as your composition. So I'm going to click OK. So now we have our black solid in here. And for our HDR file, I'm going to make like a nebula, because I'm making like a space type scene. So in order to do that, I'm going to use a plugin by Metal called Flux. So you can download a free trial from their website, and once you install it, come over to Effects and Presets, just type in Flux, and you drag it right in. And the cool thing about Flux is we have a whole bunch of presets that we can start from. So we actually have one called Nebula, which I'm going to click on here. Give it a few seconds, and we're going to see a nebula pop up into our scene. Okay, so now that we have our preset for our nebula, if you come up to frame layout, you can see that it has it started as a rectangular flat image, which is, if you're working like traditional TV or movie, you'd just be working in HD or a 4K file. And so what we need it to be is equitangular, so we can use it as an HDR file. So we come up to frame layout, and you see that we have monoscopic here. That's all we need. We don't need stereo 360 VR. But we go to monoscopic, give it a second here, and it looks like it's pushed back, but actually it's wrapping it around the sphere. And so if we come over here on our right hand side under our attributes window, you can see that we have our camera position Z. So I'm just going to drag this over to the right, and we're actually going to push more into our nebula here. So around there at 0.8, and we should have everything wrapped around. So now we have a fully functional 360 HDR file that we can now export, and we can actually use in Unreal. So to be able to use this, I'm going to click on my composition, come up to composition here, add the render queue, and then I'm going to pick an area where I want to save this. So let me go back to my desktop, go to my tutorial folder. I'm going to make one and just call it images. Right there, and click save. So now under output module where it says lossless, we want to click on this, and to be able to save it out as an HDR file out of After Effects, you want to come down to here where it says ready as sequence. So click on this, click OK, and now in our render queue, you can actually see that it switched our file to an HDR file. And so right now my timeline only have one frame, which is all we need is one image. So I'm just going to click render and we should be good to go now. So if I go into my folder that I saved it out to, go into images, now you see we have an HDR file. And so the next step will be to get everything set up in Unreal, bring in our HDR file, bring in Cinema 4D, and we should be good to go. Okay, so I have Unreal Engine open now. This is version 4.23, which is the one that integrated Cinema 4D with the Datasmith plugin. And when you open up Unreal, you'll see a tab here that says New Project. And then if you go to the tab that says Unreal Studio, you have two objects here, or you have two parameters here. You have blank, which we really don't want to start off with. We want to make a platforming game. So if we go over to Blueprint, you see we have a whole plethora of different templates we can work from. So if you want to make like a first-person shooter, if you want to make a flying game, they even have a template for vehicles, something like Grand Theft Auto. You have those options here as well. But the one that we want to work with is a side scroller because we're making like a Mario-esque side scrolling type platformer game. So we click on this and then we come down here to our settings. We want to make sure that we're working in desktop and console. I mean, you can work for mobile, but for this reference, we're going to do a console level game. We want to make sure everything's at maximum quality. And if you want to start with a starter set, that's going to give you a couple of models, a couple of textures, a couple of presets to start with. But since we already built out our own objects and everything, I'm going to go with no starter content just to keep our project light. Now come down to here where we have, it says name instead of my project. I'm just going to name it AMD level. And as you can see, I hit the space bar and it says no project names can contain a space. Unreal doesn't like spaces. And so what I'm going to do is backspace, hold down shift and do an underscore. So it's going to be AMD underscore level. And I'm going to click create project. All right, so now we have our Unreal project open. First thing we want to do is with this new version of 4.23, Unreal actually added this plugin to it where we can bring in our own HDR files. So if I click on plugins, come into built-in, go up to my search panel and just start typing in HDRI, you'll see that we have this plugin called HDR Backdrop. And so we click enable, and the only thing is once we enable it, we have to restart Unreal. So in the lower right hand corner down here, it will say Unreal Editor must be restarted. Just click restart now. It's just going to restart our scene. It only takes a few moments. So usually when I'm working in Unreal, if I'm working with any plugins, what I'm going to do is make sure I activate all those plugins so whenever it restarts instantly instead of have to rebuild the scene. So now that we have our plugin activated, we have our template here. I'm just going to start deleting all the stuff here that I don't want to use so that we can start bringing in our own stuff. So I'm going to go over to my hierarchy, just hold down the shift key, hit delete, and start really deleting a lot of these objects. I'm going to show you the objects that we do want to keep. We don't want to delete everything out of here. So I'm going to delete my sky blueprint, the text back here, the light sources. I'm going to delete these as well. And I'm going to delete the atmospheric fog. Let me see, is that everything? Yep, I want to delete my skylight. So the only thing that I'm keeping is the post-processing volume, and I'm going to keep my character here and my network player start, and that's going to allow us to keep our character. And he has the blueprint already on there, so if we use a keyboard and mouse or an Xbox controller, we can control a character, no programming at all. So I'm going to hit Control S, make sure everything's saved. And now I'm going to come over to my left-hand side here under modes. I'm going to type in HDRI, and I'm going to bring in my HDR backdrop. And as you can see, it comes with a preset already, but we're going to drag in our own. So I'm going to come over here on my right-hand side under location. I'm going to zero everything out on the X, Y, and Z, like so. And now I'm going to go to our folder where we made our HDR image from After Effects. Just going to drag this in here. There we go. Now we have our HDR file. So I'm going to click our HDR file, drag it over to HDRI. You see the area over here called Cube Map. You just drop it in there. And now we have our HDR file that we have built and it's lighting our scene. So if I zoom in here to our character, you can actually see he has all the highlights and everything because he's being lit by an HDR image. So let me double click on the character to zoom into him. You can see we have all the lighting effects on our character here, which is really cool. We can come over to backdrop. We can actually bring the intensity down a little bit. So let me see, like 0.3, because I just want my HDR file to kind of light for highlights and environmental effects, because that neon texture that we made in Cinema 4D, I really want to light everything with that. So let me hit Control S to save. I'm going to come up to Datasmith plugin, and now we're going to bring in our Cinema 4D project file. So when you click on the arrow here next to Datasmith, you'll see an icon for Cinema 4D. We just click this, and then we just have to find where we saved our Melange project from Cinema 4D. So remember, we made a Cinema 4D project specifically for Unreal Engine 4. That's why I named that one UE4. So I'm going to click on this, click open, then click OK. And then give it a few seconds to process, and then it's going to ask us what we want to import. So it's going to give us the option to import our geometry, our materials, our lights, our cameras, animation. Usually I just make sure I click everything on so I'm not missing anything. So I click import here, and we'll give us a few moments. It usually takes like a minute or two to process everything. But you'll see when it brings in our stuff from Cinema 4D, it's going to put everything into our hierarchy window exactly matched up how we had it in Cinema. Okay, so you see we have our Cinema 4D object in here. If you look in our hierarchy window, it says AMD_game level. So this is, if I pull this down, you can see we have our cloner and our figure. Everything that we have from Cinema 4D is laid out exactly how we had it in there. So I'm going to scroll this up because we have so much stuff in there. And if I zoom in here, you can see that it's kind of being eaten by our HDR image. So I'm going to click on my y-axis and just pull it up. And then also, let me double click on my character, because this is where, like where the camera is at, this is where our eyes are going to be once we start the game for our platformer. So we want to make sure our level is aligned up with that. So it looks like it might be backwards. So if I click on the top of my hierarchy for my Cinema 4D project, come down to rotate. I believe I just rotated on my z-axis by like 180, and that should bring us front and center like so. So I want to make sure that our HDR file is not clipping anything on our platformer, so I'm going to move it over. And then I'm going to bring my character over to that area as well. So let me just move this to a good spot. Then I'm going to click on my character and player start. And I'm going to bring them up here. Drag them over. And this is basically where you want your character to start in your game level. So let me double click on my character. Here we go. Bring them above the panels a little bit. What's cool is when you click on their game character here, that camera, it actually brings up like a picture-in-picture window, so you can see exactly how it's going to look like when you have your platformer going. So let me drag them back all the way to the beginning, like so. So somewhere around here should be cool. Let me hit Control S to save everything. And as you can see, our scene is still kind of dark, even though we're lighting it with the HDR. And that's because I brought the intensity level down, because I want to really light it with our neon texture that we made. So if I go into my materials, let me go back. So if I go under content, I'm going to go under our hierarchy from Cinema 4D. Go under materials, you'll see all the materials that we have built in Cinema 4D are all brought over and they're translated for Unreal Engine. So I'm going to click on the one that had an emissive light on it that I called neon. And if you see down here, we actually are able to control how much light it's emitting from that texture. So over here where it says emissive, like I left it at 100 in Cinema 4D because I didn't want to mess around with the defaults at all. So like 1 unit in Unreal equals 100 in Cinema 4D. So the reason I do that is because I can really crank up the light in Unreal. And as you can see in real time in the viewport here, the further right I'm going, the more bloom light we're getting on our background. So I'm just going to pick like a good hot area where we get lots of lighting on our character, lots of lighting on our reflective panels on the ground. So let me bring it up to maybe like, let's see what 75 looks like. All right, 75, enter, click save on here. And then I can actually bring up the lighting on my HDR just a tad bit, so like 0.5. And there we go. So if I zoom into my character, you can see the highlights and everything from the emissive coming from his side there. And also he's getting the detail from our HDR file. And so the next step is If I click play on here, our character falls directly to the floor. And we don't want that. We have to add collision to our floor so our character can run on our panels. So if I go back, let me double click on my character. I have them aligned up in the center panels here. So actually, let me click back on him, move him, make sure he's in the direct center, because these are the ones that I'm going to add collision to. So if I click on my panel here, the cool thing about the cloner object from Cinema 4D is it's instancing that original material, or not material, the original object across the board. So if I click on my object, I only have to click on one panel, and over here in our hierarchy window on the right hand side under static mesh, we double click on this, and you come over and you have to manually add a collision data to it. So if you go into collision, we can add a box collision, and you'll see like a green highlight go around it, and you click save, and you only have to do it to one object because it's going to translate that that information across everything in that cloner. So now if I go back and click play, and I'll pull out my Xbox controller here, and I'm running left and right, so now we have collision data across the board. But if I keep going over, go to my steps, he's going to fall through again. So let me go back to my character here and line up where we are. So it's real easy with the steps as well. It's the same exact thing that we did for our panels. So I'm just going to pick a random step in here. Let's say this one in the middle. Go over to static mesh, double click on this, add some collision data. And now our steps are fully functional. We can run down our steps. And while we're at it, I'm going to go to my bottom platform down here, add some collision data to that as well. Click on save. And now we have a fully fleshed out game. If I click play, pull up my Xbox controller again. I'm running across, coming down the steps. And when I get onto this platform, I'm running across. So there you go. That's how easy it is to make a game with Cinema 4D and Unreal, and even light everything with After Effects as well. And if you wanted to share this with your friends, you can actually package it up as an executable file. You can share it with your friends. If you actually make a game, you can sell it on Steam, etc. So it's real easy to do. What we're going to do is come over to File, come on down to Package Projects, and we're going to go down to Packaging Settings. So now I want to come over to under Project where it says Supported Platforms. I only want to have my desktop and my Windows because that's the targeted platform that I'm going to be making a game for. So if I click on All Platforms here, now I'm able to only select the platforms that I want to shoot this out for. So like I said, we want desktop and Windows. Then I'm come under Target Hardware, make sure that we're in desktop console mode and we're on maximum quality. So now let me drag this down to, we should see Windows down here under platforms. Here we go, Windows. And I don't have any art per se, but if you wanted to make like a splash screen, or even if you wanted to make an icon for your executables, this is where you're going to set everything up. So you come under platforms, Windows, you can make your own key art and everything. So whenever you start your game, your splash art is going to come up. And now the last thing I want to do is I want to target my frame rate at 60 frames per second. So if I come up to search and type in frame, you can see now we get the frame rate panel up. I'm going to click off a smooth frame rate, and I'm going to go for a fixed frame rate, and I want to target for 60 FPS because right now I'm using the Ryzen 9 3900 with the Radeon 5700 in there, and so 60 frames per second should be no problem at all. So I'm going to exit this out, hit Control S, and now come back over to File, come under Package Project, and now I'm going to come under Windows. I'm going to make a 64-bit version, and it's just going to, do a little bit of calculation here, and it's going to ask me where I want to save it at. And so I'm just going to save this to my desktop, make a new folder, call this one AMD Game Done. Select this folder, and now over here in my lower right-hand corner, I'm going to click on Show Output Log, and you're going to see if there's any type of errors or anything wrong with your project. But once it's done, at the very bottom, you'll see it say Project Success, and then we can go to our executable, play the game, and we'll be all finished from there. Okay, so now you see that we have Project Success. I'm going to exit out of Unreal. And I'm going to find on my desktop where I made the executable file, which was under AMD Game Done folder here. Double click on that. And it's always going to have this folder, Windows No Editor. You just double click on there. Now you have an executable file for your game. So if you double click on it, hit allow. So whether you're using the keyboard or using your Xbox controller, now you have a fully fleshed out game that you can share with your friends across the board, or even start selling once you have something fully fleshed out.